Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rock Studios. I'm Stan Miller. I'm the PR and Analyst Relations Manager for Rockwell Automation in the EMEA region, and I'm joined by John Speakman. He is a OT Networks and Cybersecurity Specialist for Rockwell. John, welcome to the studio.
Nice to be here. Nice to meet you.
So we're here to talk about IT, OT best practices, security, an incredibly important topic and one of very high interest. So maybe we could just start out by you explaining some of the differences between OT and IT security.
Sure. So I think one of the main differences that we establish early on when we're having these conversations is the outcomes of getting it wrong. Okay, so in IT, if there's a problem with cybersecurity or there's an attack of some sort, then an IT system is going to go down and take your email servers, things like that. In an OT environment with manufacturing, with safety systems, like for example, included as well, if something goes wrong, then the outcomes are physical rather than digital. So we could have customers that are producing pharmaceutical products that have a very precise recipe. We could have customers that are operating with a hazardous environment where there could be an explosive or environmental risk or a risk to the public or their employees. And financial risk as well. If production stops, if smoke stops coming out the chimney, as sometimes we say, then there is a huge financial impact on there. So the consequences of getting it wrong are much clearer, I think, when we're talking about OT. So once we've established that, that's one of the early conversations we have as to why we need to treat this differently. So very often we'll be asked by the IT teams, why do we need to treat this any differently than we do our IT network? We already have security. We already have standards and principles and technology that we use. Why can't we just use this in OT? And I think once you've established that there is a fundamental difference in getting it wrong, then you're off on the right foot. But one of the big issues that we're dealing with in OT is, compared to IT, is that you have legacy environments, very old manufacturing environments, very old networks that have been in production for a long time, usually with very little maintenance. You'll find that in IT that there is usually a small number of vendors that they partner with, maybe one vendor that's supplying switches, another supplying servers and so on. Whereas in OT there could be dozens, if not hundreds of different manufacturers, different partners, Rockwell and so on, that will be involved in those production networks, all of different security requirements, talking different protocols, have different demands in terms of the availability of data and so on. So, again, brings a big challenge to it. And then I mentioned safety as well. Safety systems these days are typically integrated into the manufacturing network, and I think it's fairly obvious that the consequences of a breach on a safety network or safety instrumented systems could be pretty catastrophic.
John, what are some of the important steps manufacturers should take to ensure their approach to OT security can help protect themselves from potential attacks?
So the first step, and it sounds like an easy one to take, but the first step really is to align yourself to a standard. This is usually where we start, right? Especially with customers that have lots of sites in lots of different countries, they're looking for consistency. So by aligning to a standard, and we typically would suggest something like IC 62443. By aligning to that standard, you ensure that all your sites are dealt with in the same way. They're all aligning to the same standard. That's the first thing, okay? So get the customer to agree to align to the standard. And then how you actually begin the journey is, first of all, by understanding what the risk is. Because you may be a manufacturer of wines and spirits, but that doesn't mean that the risk is going to be the same at every single one of your sites, because you're going to have sites of different age. You may have sites that you've acquired, so the control system's been built in a completely different way. You could have sites that are handling high volumes of spirit, in like 500,000 litre containers, which obviously have a big explosive risk. Or you could just be a bottling site, which, again, so that they're all different environments. So understanding your environment and the risk associated with that, because when you're developing your program of countermeasures, it needs to be appropriate to the level of risk that you've identified. So often we'll find that IT have recognized that there's a problem with security. They'll have thrown some money at the problem and try to implement some sort of security controls. But because they haven't properly understood what the real fundamental issues are in the OT network, often these measures are, there's money being spent unnecessarily or without any real noticeable effect. So understanding exactly what the risk is, what your vulnerabilities are, building an asset inventory, and the guidelines, so 62443, I mentioned the standard, it has all these steps in there that you take in a methodical way to really understand what your problems are before you start going really spending too much money on it.
Really good context. Thank you for that. Let me ask you this. What is the role of workers in ensuring OT best practices?
Yeah, so I would say it's often an overlooked source of information is the people that are actually day-to-day operating the machines. So you think of a worker that stood in front of a HMI, they're stood in front there, on a shift for many hours a day. They know how that line operates. They know how that machine operates. They know how the HMI should operate and should work. And often we'll be dealing with a cybersecurity incident, and a worker, when part of the investigation, a worker will say, I noticed something strange happening with the HMI. It was slow to respond, or the mouse was moving on the screen, and I just thought it was weird. Right? Now, these are little subtle things, or a screen suddenly blinking or being slow to respond can be an indication that something is not right on the network. Maybe there's some malware, maybe there's an actual attacker on the network, or a ransomware gang that's carrying out reconnaissance on the network and actually causing these sort of what appear to be minor interferences that aren't being detected by any sort of network monitoring, if there is any, right? But, the eyes on the screen have noticed something different. So education of these kind of frontline operators to see that, something doesn't look quite right, report it. So having these people properly trained, they're usually very highly trained in operating the machines and making the products that they're there to make, but just having that little bit of extra training for them to recognize that something might not quite be quite right is a really good early warning.
John, thank you so much for coming into the studio and sharing your insight into such an important topic.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about IT, OT best practices for cybersecurity, please visit us at roklive-emea.com.